Well, most automotive buffs will certainly know about the 1960 to 1969 Corvair. The Corvair was introduced in 1960 as a compact vehicle from General Motors. It really a time during which Americans were starting to think more about driving efficiently, in part because of the late 1950s recession, and also just frankly wanting to drive something that was a little bit smaller, as many of the domestic vehicles of the day were quite large. So little Corvair came to market, and it was a pretty radical design for General Motors at least. Not only was the car much smaller, but it also had an air-cooled flat six-cylinder engine in the rear of the vehicle that displaced 140 cubic inches. By the way, it would be 140 cubic inches only in 1960. Then in 1961, it was enlarged slightly to 145 cubic inches. That would last through till 1963. And then in 1964, the engine would be enlarged again, this time to 164 cubic inches, and it would remain 164 cubic inches all the way through the last Corvair that was produced in 1969. By the way, there are two generations of Corvairs. Both look very different. Both are handsome. My favorite's the second generation. This is the first generation car, and this is the second generation car that came out in 1965 and would last all the way through till 1969. Now, the Corvair was quite the initial sales success, and during its run, there would be 1.8 million Corvairs sold from 1960 to 1969, with the peak year being 1962, in which the car sold about 340,000 units. After the publication of Ralph Nader's book, Unsafe at Any Speed, Corvair sales dwindled pretty precipitously, and in its final years, it was selling 20,000 units or under. So it was time for the Corvair to be put out to pasture. But as I said, it really was a radical little car for Chevrolet with that rear engine, six-cylinder, air-cooled engine. And there were some, let's say, good things and bad things about the Corvair. One of the issues that it had was that the handling could admittedly be a little bit twitchy, with its swing axle design in the rear, at least the initial swing axle design that would last from 1960 through 1963. In 1964, there was a one-year-only kind of stopgap measure that was included on the Corvair, and that was a single leaf spring on either side of the rear suspension to help mitigate the swing axle's inherent issues. And then in 1965, the car suspension was redesigned to be quite similar to the Corvette's independent rear suspension. Corvair always had an independent rear suspension, but originally with the swing axle design, the camber would change and rotate as the car would handle or the wheel would move up and down. And by the time the suspension was redesigned in 1965, that was no longer the case. And you can imagine if the camber is changing with the load of the vehicle and the weight of the vehicle, especially with a rear engine car that the weight distribution is pretty biased to the rear, well, that does cause some oversteer conditions if you're not careful. Now, one interesting little fact that most people don't know about the Corvair is that it almost became a Pontiac. And you're going to say, well, Pontiac introduced its senior compact Tempest in 1961. They had a car that was very similar to the Corvair. No, it was not. The Tempest that was introduced in 1961 was really such a different car from the Corvair in many ways. Originally, though, Pontiac was supposed to get kind of a pure variant of the Corvair called the Polaris, and that's what you see here. Now, notice that in this photo, as you compare it to the actual production Corvair, there really aren't many differences. This is effectively a true badge-engineered vehicle. It's something that General Motors didn't really do back then, effectively taking the same car and then rebadging it to Chevrolet, rebadging it as a Pontiac. Has the same headlamps up front, same hood, same bumper, same fenders, same quarters, same roof panel, same doors, same windshield and backlight and everything. Really, the only differences are little pieces of trim. And up front, you have, of course, Pontiac spelled out in block letters and the arrowhead up top. It's a good-looking little car, but it certainly isn't much different from Chevrolet. And apparently, at this point, according to John DeLorean's book, On a Clear Day, You Can See General Motors leadership was really trying to force the Corvair, kind of in its pure form, upon Pontiac to make the Pontiac dealers sell it. But DeLorean, who was then Pontiac's chief engineer and general manager, Bunky Knudsen, had other ideas and really did not want the Pontiac division to sell a Corvair that was completely unaltered. And as we transition to the rear of the vehicle, you'll notice that, again, basically everything is pretty much similar to the Corvair on the Pontiac Polaris. Notice the big script on the deck lid there and the logo, Pontiac Polaris, with some kind of symbol there in the middle. The only thing I can discern that's somewhat different is that little air extractor out the bottom, somewhat different from the 1960 Corvair rear, but aside from that, not much else. So clearly General Motors management was proposing minimal changes for Pontiac, probably trying to get some economies of scale out of the sheet metal and the glass and everything else, and this was just not going to fly with Pontiac. Now, notice that the previous two photographs that I've shown are dated around August of 1958. And now take a look here at this particular photo that's dated January of 1959. So clearly the Pontiac leadership was not going to go forward and probably made it clear to the corporation that, look, we're not just going to badge engineer the Corvair and not change any sheet metal, especially after the 1959 Pontiac that had that split grille up front. Of course, here there's no split grille because there's no reason for a radiator. The car still has an air-cooled engine in the rear, so it's grille-less, but it does have this kind of twin-port look up front with the area that's been scalloped out around the headlamps and the turn signals. And you can see that in this case, this would require a unique hood, unique kind of trim around the headlights. The car also appears to have unique front fenders, as well as quarter panels. And I think the doors are the same. Obviously, the roof is the same. The glass is the same. But the Pontiac team has taken off any of the Brightwork moldings that went on the doors and the fenders, although you can see these little, I guess, wind splits on either side of the car up front. It would be similar to what would make its way to the 1961 Tempest. So Pontiac's starting to get a little bit of what they want. An interesting little crease that starts behind the headlamps and then continues into the door. Now, because the doors were shared, the Pontiac stylists would have had to kind of blend the styling of the fenders into the doors. You notice that crease starts as being relatively light and then gets heavier and has a more significant undercut and concave surface as it goes rearward to blend in with the surfacing that came with the Corvair doors. And then as we look out back, you'll notice that the rear quarter is unique. And I like how you've got that crease that runs kind of from in front of the rear wheel all the way backward that kind of hits the center of the rear bumper. And then the rear bumper is dividing the tail lamps, which are a mirror reflection of each other on the top as well as the bottom. Something that would be used again by General Motors. I think the next time that this might have been used would be the 1967 Oldsmobile 88 Customs in the rear, where the tail lamps were reflected. But perhaps there was a different application as well. Nonetheless, this was clearly a car that had much more unique sheet metal than what was originally proposed for the Pontiac Pursuit, but it just wasn't good enough for Pontiac. And here we have one more side-by-side photo of the Corvair with the Stillborn Pontiac Polaris. And you'll see the front end sheet metal is completely unique, different hoods, different fenders as well. And the Pontiac's fender clearly is more rounded and kind of tucks down, whereas the Corvair's has that ledge, if you will, that surface under which there's a concavity before you have a convex surface. Not so with the Pontiac, much more smooth and clean. I kind of like, actually, the Pontiac Polaris front end in this case. But I do find it funny that Pontiac had to find a way to execute its twin-port theme with no grille up front. And I think they did so relatively successfully. Now, of course, Pontiac would go in a completely different direction when it would introduce its Tempest for 1961, although there were some styling elements from that Pontiac Polaris that you can see in the Tempest, including those little wind splits on either side of the car. But clearly, the 1961 Tempest really did lean even harder into that twin-port theme. By this point, the success of the 1959 Pontiac and that twin-port theme was well known, and Pontiac stylists, I'm sure, just wanted to lean in even harder to that design. And the 61 Tempest is almost a mini 1959 Pontiac, if you will. But in his book, in John DeLorean's book, On a Clear Day You Can See General Motors, DeLorean detailed a bit more about why Pontiac decided to go into a different direction. He said that it was in part because the Pontiac engineers didn't like the way that the Corvair handled, perhaps not surprisingly, with the swing axle design that we talked about, and that they just felt that they could get the same advantages as the Corvair or similar advantages with a totally different style layout. And so the Tempest would be significantly different from the Corvair. The first thing was that the Tempest would have near 50-50 weight distribution because it would have a transaxle in the rear. The transmission and the axle and all of that was mounted in the rear, and that was, I want to say, certainly for General Motors, the first time that a car had a rear transaxle with the transmission mounted back there. Might have been the first time for any domestic automaker in mass production form that was the case. And the idea there was that Pontiac engineers were trying to get the same kind of flattish floor that the Corvair had up front that was allowed because obviously the engine was in the rear. So you didn't have to have the drive shaft, didn't have to have exhaust running to the rear. And so the Corvair interiors had very flat floors up front as a consequence. Well, the Tempest didn't have a completely flat floor, but by moving the transmission to the rear, you certainly took out a lot of the requirement for having a big bump in the floor pan. Well, the only thing that you really had to have was a so-called rope drive, the kind of flexible drive shaft that was very thin, that was contained within a tube that would move to the rear. And it was able to be thin because the transmission was in the rear, so that drive shaft didn't have to take the engine's torque that would be multiplied by a torque converter. It would just have to take the engine's torque on its own. And that little drive shaft just spins continuously on your Tempest, whether or not the engine and the transmission are in drive or reverse or neutral. It's always spinning. You can kind of hear a little whine when you start up a Tempest, and that's because the drive shaft starts spinning kind of the second that the engine lights off. So Pontiac engineers were able to get that, I would say, that good passenger space up front, and then they used a conventional, unconventional engine under hood, as opposed to that air-cooled six-cylinder engine, which GM engineers probably felt, at least outside of the Chevrolet division, felt was relatively unproven. Pontiac engineers took their tried-and-true 389 cubic inch V8, which was based on the Pontiac overhead valve V8, and effectively just lopped off half the cylinders. So you had a slant 4 that displaced 195 cubic inches. So while it's somewhat radical because it's just half of a Pontiac V8, I'm oversimplifying, it's not just half, but that is where the design came from. It's clearly evident that that's what it was. This was quite novel for the time, but it also was proven. It was just all cast iron. It was a four-cylinder. It was a big four-cylinder, 195 cubic inches. So the hardest thing was really quelling its vibration with the absence of a balance shaft. And that was done with very, very soft motor mounts. You can even see here the air cleaner had to be specially mounted with a bracket in order to make sure that, I guess, it didn't vibrate, or probably some of these were making annoying noises under the hood, and that was done to better secure the air cleaner and kind of help it with the vibration. These four-cylinder engines were pretty reliable in the Tempest. The things that weren't necessarily reliable were the timing chain on these would tend to stretch and break because of the engine vibration. But aside from the timing chains, they were pretty good. They were just as reliable as the Pontiac V8. Unfortunately, the Tempest torque transmission in the rear wasn't as reliable. The manual transmissions were just fine, but the automatic really wasn't that great and wasn't that durable. It did have an interesting feature that you could watch the torque converter spin underneath the car. It was completely exposed. I don't think that was probably all that great for reliability either, especially if you were driving through the snow or, I don't know, other different things. You don't want the torque converter just spinning out there in the open, but that's what they did. And I guess it was okay, but like I said, the automatic transmissions really weren't that great. But the engine, aside from the timing chains, very reliable. I should say, aside from the timing chains and the vibration, they did have some vibrations, although it wasn't necessarily that offensive. And Pontiac really leaned into their four-cylinder, making performance variants of it. It was called the Trophy 4V, and it made up to 166 horsepower in naturally aspirated form. There were no turbochargers or anything else on the Trophy 4, but it could come with a 4-barrel carburetor and 166 horsepower, whereas the Corvair, the engine would make it all the way up to 180 horsepower, but it would require a turbocharger to do so. I suspect that Pontiac engineers originally perhaps made this 166 horsepower. The Trophy 4 would last from 1961 to 1963. And during that run, it was more powerful than the turbocharged Corvair, which had come out in 1962 that would make 150 horsepower in its inaugural year. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this little spotlight on the stillborn Pontiac Polaris, the car and the Corvair that never was. What do you think? Should Pontiac have produced this or have gone with their Tempest that was highly unconventional, maybe even more unconventional than the Corvair, but also a little bit more conventional in terms of the engine at least, and certainly in terms of the weight distribution? Put a comment in the comment section. Let me know. Thanks for watching.